All right, I think we can get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on anticipatory grief in long-term care, presented by this brilliant team from Malis Health. Before we begin, there's a somber note that I would like to begin this on. Unfortunately, I would like to offer my sincerest condolences for all of the families and the community of Tumbler Ridge, BC. Listening to that news yesterday, it was just so heartbreaking and just so heavy. So it's a very sobering moment for all of us. And while we're learning about the approaches on how to tackle grief in long-term care, I think there are some approaches that I will be taking back with me as well. So it's an important lesson for all of us today. Okay. On a separate note, I would also like to acknowledge that I am joining this webinar from the traditional, unceded, stolen, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I am very grateful to live, learn, and work on these lands. I know that many of you might be joining this webinar from this province or from other shared territories across the country. So please feel free to acknowledge these territories in the chat function as well. Moving on, as I mentioned, today's Lunch and Learn is being presented by this amazing team from Malis Health, Clara Dick and Lisa Matthews. The purpose of today's webinar is to learn ways in which LTC homes can identify and support anticipatory grief among residents, family caregivers, and staff, fostering the environment to be as grounded in empathy and understanding as possible. Before I hand it over to speakers, I would like to cover a few housekeeping rules. So today's webinar is being recorded. We will be able to share the slides of the webinar and the recording after the event is complete, and I'll share all of those in an email with you. We also welcome you to revisit the content for yourself and share it with your colleagues. We also ask you that while the presentation is going on, please keep yourself on mute. And then once the presentation is done, we will have some designated time for question and answers. So feel free to unmute yourselves then and ask any questions that you might have. Additionally, you can also share any of the questions that come up for you in the chat function. And Erica, my colleague, and we would be happy to save those questions and ask them at the end of the webinar. So, okay, at this time, I'm going to hand over the very metaphorical mic to Clara and Lisa. So take it away, guys.
Clara, shall I start?
Yes, yes, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for taking time to join us for this Lunch and Learn today. My name is Lisa Matthews. My background is in nursing leadership and health system improvement, both in Canada and internationally. And much of my recent work has focused on strengthening care delivery within both long-term care and community settings. I really believe that care homes sit at the center of people's lives, often when they are most vulnerable. And that's where the relationship between those who are taking care of them really matter, where the families are really deeply involved, and where the realities of aging and life-limiting illnesses show up every day for them. So long-term care may not be the center of our healthcare system, but it is actually absolutely central to how people experience it, including and specifically around end of life. And so that means our responsibility extends beyond just managing symptoms. We're walking alongside these residents and their families, and we're supporting not only their emotional and clinical needs, but relational and practical realities of living with life-limiting illnesses. And so therefore, anticipatory grief touches everybody involved, and how we understand and respond to it can actually shape the entire experience of care. And on that note, I'm very pleased to introduce Clara, who's going to guide us into that really important conversation today.
Thank you, Lisa. So my name is Clara Dick. I'm a clinical nurse specialist in hospice palliative care. Over the last 20 years, I've supported people and programs to deliver high quality palliative end of life care across all healthcare sectors, community, hospital, and hospice. Most recently, I was the BC research lead for strengthening a palliative approach to long-term care with McMaster University. And in those 3 years, I saw the change that it made to care delivery and confidence in the staff. And so I'm continuing to hold that torch and to keep that work going. And I'm doing that with Lisa. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge, and it's timely today, every time I talk about grief, I take a moment and I say, we are human first. So if you have had a recent loss in your family, or you've had a recent death in your long-term care home, or multiple deaths, which can build up the grief experience, and if we at all are talking about something that touches you or triggers you, take the time you need, step away, and I'm happy to connect with you after, or I know Lisa will, and to see if there's any way we can support you. But do look after yourself, especially in the light of our collective grief that we are experiencing for Tumbler Ridge. All right, and so Simran, you did a beautiful land acknowledgement, and I always like to start here. This is a picture of Kalamalka Lake and the beautiful land which Melis lives, works, and plays with. And I like to say it's a good place to live, and it's also a very good place to die. So this is our little agenda, what we're going to cover today. We have a lot of information to cover. And this isn't just going to be me talking. We have some polls. I'm going to pull out a whiteboard and we're all going to experience new technology together. I'm going to get you to be typing and working on the screen in real time. So we're going to talk about overview of grief, what's normal grief in quotations, what is what, let's pull some terms apart. And then we're going to talk about anticipatory grief. And while I was doing some work into anticipatory grief, the idea and the concept of ambiguous grief came up. And now ambiguous grief is very applicable to long-term care. So I've just kind of married them in. They have different key factors in them that separate them, but they definitely both can go hand in hand. We're going to end with some practical strategies and support for you and your long-term care. Okay, so let's get started. So here's an overview on grief and types of grief. Now here there are 12 listed. Some lists have 10, some have 8, but for our purposes, we're going to go with this. We're going to focus on anticipatory grief, which is right here, and then ambiguous grief, which is right here. You can see that this is going to be adventurous today. And I do want to point out, in the view of what's happening in our province yesterday, what we're experiencing right now is called collective grief. As a province, as a country, we are grieving for the families and friends in Tumbler Ridge. And this also has a bit of an aspect of traumatic grief. So you can see that grief is normal in quotations, but there's different aspects. And today we're going to focus on anticipatory and ambiguous grief. So first, I want to say that grief is a normal and it's a healthy human response to loss. It is not pathological. Nothing is wrong with people. They are walking, or in this case, sailing their journey of grief and mourning. Here we see a map of different experiences and emotions that people can experience on their grief journey. You'll see emotions mentioned like pockets of peace, or I don't care at all, or sea serpent of toxic positivity. And what I don't see here is anger, and anger can be very a part of a normal grief journey, and it can be a healthy experience. Some experiences mentioned in the grief journey are experiencing ways of mourning. So you see mountains of tissues on the right-hand side, right here, or the waterfall of tears. And you'll also see the fog bank of the future. So the fog bank is actually a physiological change in the brain. Mary Frances O'Connor wrote a book in 2022 called The Grieving Brain: The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss. In this, she details how grief and loss impacts brain chemistry and the physiology, bringing into perspective why people experience this brain fog. The last thing I want to say about grief is that it is as unique as the person who is experiencing it. Each person will experience in their own way and will, although we do see common feelings and experiences kind of across the board. However, people experience these feelings in their own order, intensity, and duration. So let's move on to a 3-minute clip that describes different ways of looking at grief. So these are kind of like different models or pictures that you can hold in your head as you're approaching grief. And very interesting in the light of what's happened in Tumbler Ridge to think about how you're reacting to our collective grief right now.
Grief is a natural response to loss. It's the emotional pain we feel when someone or something we love is taken away from us. Coping with loss is one of life's hardest challenges. In this video, I want to share 3 powerful analogies for understanding grief and the way it can change over time. The ball and the box. Imagine your life is a closed box containing a ball of grief and a pain button. When you're first faced with a loss, grief can feel huge, filling your life and leaving little space for anything else. Because it's so large, it's difficult to ignore and hits the pain button over and over again. To cope, you might withdraw from the people and activities you care about, but grief is a fickle thing and hits the pain button in ways you aren't prepared for. How you experience this pain is a very individual process. You might feel depressed, angry, or numb, all of which are natural reactions to loss. At times, the pain may be overwhelming and feels like there will never be room inside the box for anything else again. Over time, the ball gets smaller, leaving room for other aspects of your life, like returning to work and seeing friends. It hits the button less often, but when it does, it still hurts. Although the ball gets smaller, for most people, it never goes away completely, and you will always miss that person. The time it takes to get smaller is different for everyone, but with time, you gradually come to accept that they're gone. Growing around grief. Grief is often thought of something that slowly gets smaller over time. But another way of looking at grief and recovery was suggested by Dr. Lois Tonkin. Grief stays the same size, but slowly life begins to grow bigger around it, leaving space in our lives to be filled alongside grief. We can still grieve the loss of someone or something that we loved while growing a new life. Whirlpool of grief. Dr. Richard Wilson imagines the process of grieving as a journey taken along the everyday river of life. When we experience loss, our raft plunges down the steep waterfall of bereavement, which is a sudden shock and linked with feelings like numbness and denial. At the bottom of the waterfall, we find ourselves swept up into the whirlpool of grief, where our life is in turmoil, and we feel emotions like anger, guilt, or stress. We might escape the whirlpool and find ourselves washed up on the banks of the river, feeling stuck and unable to move forwards. Or we're thrown on the rocks at the edge of the whirlpool, where emotional pain hits us at unexpected times. Finally, we leave the whirlpool and join a new stream as we start to accept the loss and move towards loving again. We all experience this journey differently, and some of us may have sturdier boats than others with strong family support to help guide us. Did any of these analogies resonate with you? If so, which one was your favorite? Please let me know in the comments.
So this, I'll move on to the next. So this, what those clips show is that grief is not a linear experience. It ebbs and flows. People can bounce from one experience to the next, such as in the whirlpool. Sometimes they're on the sandy beach, sometimes they hit the rocks. Sometimes that happens once a day that they hit the rocks, or sometimes it happens 10 times a day. It also highlights that when we talk about ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief, is that sometimes people can get stuck. And so we'll talk a little bit about getting stuck. Maybe their jar doesn't grow bigger, so the grief takes up so much of their jar. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. So now, what's what? We often throw these words out about, oh, they're in the midst of the grief and bereavement. And so to kind of pull them apart, grief is the internal emotional experience of loss. So that's where we feel all our feelings, the sadness, the anger, the anxiety, the shock. Um, and while mourning on the bottom term is the outward expression of that grief through actions. It's the active way you process your internal feelings. So these mourning actions can be through rituals, behaviors like crying, attending funerals, wearing specific colors, or sharing memories. These serve as the necessary active path to healing and integrating that loss into our life. And, you know, in terms of our collective grief, sometimes different memorials will pop up in different places, such as when we think about 9/11 in New York, different firehouses across the country or across the continent will have memorials set up outside. That is us publicly mourning together. So mourning helps with grief. While you will always have grief, engaging in mourning helps you adapt to the loss, reconcile with it, and eventually engage with life. So when we ignore mourning, it delays healing. So when we suppress our grief by avoiding mourning, it can be destructive. It can lead to some difficult or complicated grief. It's like trying to hold a basketball underwater. It's very hard. Um, and then the last term is bereavement. So bereavement refers to the period of mourning after the death of a loved one. So where does this leave family members of those with dementia? BC Seniors Advocate indicates that dementia remains in the top 5 causes of death for people over 65 in BC. Additionally, CIHI 2025, Canadian Institute for Health Information, indicates that people in long-term care have an average of 6 comorbidities across Canada. That's a lot. So we can see that the setting is ripe for people to experience anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief. But before we get into picking those apart, we're going to have our first poll. So Simran, if you want to pop that poll up, and if you want to click your answer, there's 2 questions. They're yes or no. Okay, so we can see here that 68% of us have heard of anticipatory grief, and about a third of us have not heard about anticipatory grief. So this is a good mix because we have some people who will share some of their wisdom in working with anticipatory grief, and we have lots of people to learn from that. Now, do you want to do the next poll? Now, this is about ambiguous grief. Now, I do want to acknowledge that in this question, I put, have you heard of ambiguous loss? And in that, I meant ambiguous loss and grief. Okay, so you can see that ambiguous loss is actually flipped. So about 30% of us have heard of ambiguous loss and grief, and about 71% or 70% have not heard of ambiguous loss and grief. So we hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be familiar with both of the terms, and we can move those needles a little bit. All right, you can stop that poll. Thank you very much, Simran. So we are going to talk about anticipatory grief here. Whoops, I'm not very good with the cursor, and ambiguous grief and loss. Okay, so here you see two pictures. The one on the left is grieving a loss before it happens, and that is anticipatory grief. It's the grief we feel when we anticipate a loss. In a 2020 interview, Rudy, a dementia care partner to his wife Karen, summarized his own anticipatory grief. I was looking forward to a retirement at 65 or 67 and being postured correctly, maybe even downsizing. But because of the diagnosis, all the plans that we had or thought that we had just got sidetracked so quickly. So when we think of loss and grief, it can be grieving the loss of a dream of traveling, expecting to have a spouse. Can be grieving seeing your adult child grow up, maybe grieving not having grandchildren or not having a normal adulthood for your child. And sometimes just life doesn't turn out how we expect it. And that's that anticipatory grief that we experience over that. And if you think about average of 5 diagnoses per long-term care home resident, there would be a lot of anticipatory grief there. Now, up to the top is this statement, gone but not gone. And I really like that because that kind of summarizes ambiguous grief and loss. So, ambiguous grief and loss was coined by Dr. Pauline Boss in the 1970s, a type of unresolved grief occurring when a loved one is either physically absent but psychologically present. So, that's like a missing person or a kidnapping or like a soldier being away at war, or physically present but psychologically absent. So, potentially a dementia, an addiction. I know we have some long-term care homes that have younger population. They have an acquired brain injury because of maybe they had an opioid overdose uh, incident. I'm sorry, I'm not coining that properly, and I apologize. Or people are in a coma. So why these two types of loss are so difficult is because unlike death, there has not been a death. There are no societal rituals, like there's no funeral, there's no way to acknowledge the loss, leading to confusion, guilt, or even frozen grief. So that would be somebody continually swirling in the whirlpool and not moving forward. I'm making a little swirly here. Or it could be the jar around their grief doesn't grow because they've frozen in their grief and their life has essentially stopped. So ambiguous loss complicates grief. Sorry, I'm just looking at my notes here. And it's important to note that people diagnosed with dementia can also experience their own ambiguous grief. So a lot of the time we talk about the caregiver, but the person with the illness is actually experiencing their own loss as well. They may mourn their independence and certain cherished personal traits and abilities. So an example of this is it's not in long-term care, but it's kind of connected to the same idea. I live and work in some rural areas, and I was visiting someone in like it's like a brain activity group. It's keeping people's brains stimulated and their bodies. So he's 85 and he looked at me and he said, I just can't believe it. Last year I was running a chainsaw and now I can barely walk. And so that's that ambiguous loss of gone but not gone, here but not here. And this is what I do, but I can't do it anymore. And some of the key characteristics of both of these, but particularly ambiguous grief, is lack of closure. There's no clear ending. There's no answer to the why behind the loss. There's also uncertainty. So that's a hallmark of both of these. Anticipatory grief, you don't know you think somebody's going to die, or they have a degenerative illness, and so it's going to be changing. You don't know when, you don't know how fast, you don't know how slow, and so there's a lot of uncertainty. There is also lingering hope. It's going in their health or wellness is going in a certain direction, but you still hope that things won't end up like they are likely to. And then also with these two, there is a huge sense of isolation. So the unconventional nature of the loss can make it difficult to find understanding and support from others. All right, so now we're going to go on our next technology adventure together. So, Simran, let's give whiteboards a shot. This is where we're going to share what examples of anticipatory grief you have seen in your long-term care home. So off to the left here, we see this T. So you take a text box, you click on that with your cursor, and then you click it anywhere on the whiteboard. And I'd like you to share examples of when you've seen anticipatory grief. And so let's say, I'm going to say, what have I seen? I have seen um, acquired brain injury, not brain injury.
Claire, I'm not seeing the whiteboard. Are other people seeing it? We can see your slide on the whiteboard, but not the actual whiteboard itself.
Oh yeah. Okay, I think a few people can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. Move that over. So Lisa, I'm just going to go with this and I'll just speak it out so you can hear it. Okay, so I put down acquired brain injury. Somebody put down a vast group of dementia. Somebody wrote new admissions. Adult children of someone with dementia. Yes. Tracy wrote grieving for a spouse who has dementia but no longer recognizes it. And somebody wrote during times of loss of function. Oh, new admissions with poor prognosis. Okay. So yes, absolutely. A grieving spouse. Yeah, that's anticipatory grief because they no longer recognize them. What else is going to happen? People with dementia, new admissions with poor prognosis, yes, they can see and they know, hopefully there's been a palliative approach conversation that this is what we can expect. Lots of those would be happening, particularly because we know across Canada, the average length of admission in long-term care is 1.5 years. And then during times of loss of function, yes. So that's great. So I'm seeing there's somebody has done a beautiful job with, oh, is that wheelchair? Yeah, I'm seeing a nod. Okay, yeah, wheelchair bound. That's a loss of walking. Okay. Now I love seeing, I'm kind of going like this because everybody's got their cursor moving around and it's exciting to see things real time. Now, Simran, let's go back to um, the presentation if you want to close the whiteboard. Okay, so you can see that you shared many of the examples. It can be a pretty broad category. So we've got terminal diagnoses, and somebody mentioned, if there's a poor prognosis, there can be anticipatory grief with that. And then even when we talked about having those end of life or palliative approach conversations on admission, that can cause some anticipatory grief. Bearing in mind it will decrease crisis and difficulty making decisions later, impending death of a pet. So one area of anticipatory grief that we don't often talk about, especially in long-term care, is the loss of people's animals, whether they can see them regularly or not. Awaiting an organ transplant, undergoing amputation. I know that when people have diabetes for a long time, sometimes they can get an ischemic foot and they might experience an amputation. And then progressive disease down here on the bottom. And even the life-changing event of moving into a long-term care home
Sarah, you're on notes view. We can see your speaker notes just to let you.
So let's move on. So what are examples of ambiguous grief you have seen in your long-term care home? It's 108. You know what? In interest of time, I'm actually going to just keep on going. But thank you all for embarking in whiteboard business. We'll see if we can get it better next time. So this is a pretty broad category. And when we are looking in long-term care, we're looking at mainly physically present but psychologically absent. So we mentioned some of these: dementia, Alzheimer's, if people have mental illness that has progressed, if there's been a brain injury, chronic illness, addictions, depression, and workaholism, which maybe we would not see in long-term care because people would be retired. Okay. So when we think about grief, we think of grief in terms of the whole person. Here's an overview of what's included in normal. I say normal in quotations. Grief, we're looking at spiritual, physical, emotional, and behavioral um, um, effects. So these are, when we think about grief, remember, these are internal aspects of what we're feeling. So you'll see that we've talked a lot about the emotional impacts of grief or manifestations. We will see some behavioral manifestations. We talked about poor concentration or brain fog. Social isolation can be a big one. And then up here, we'll see physical manifestations. So headaches, stomach aches, heartache, like people's heart literally will be sore. Changes in appetite for sure. And then spiritual manifestations. So it can change people's faith. It can change, like hope can become involved. People may have difficulties forgiving. So these are all normal responses to grief. Now let's see some of the key differences in anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief. So in terms of anticipatory grief and loss, it's those feelings that happen inside before the death. And it can also be grieving the loss of a relationship. And also, when people are caregivers at home and they move their loved one into long-term care, they can have that's a change in the caregiver relationship, and there can be a lot of guilt around that. As well, these feelings may be for the person who is ill, but the feelings may also be related to a loss in your own life. So anticipatory grief can be anticipating the death of your loved one, or it can be anticipating a loss in your own life. And again, in terms of ambiguous grief, lack of closure. You don't know what's going to happen. You can see, with a brain injury, you don't know how long they will be alive with their brain injury. You don't know how it's going to affect their body. With a dementia diagnosis, you don't know. Well, you can see, the average progression of dementia, but you don't know when they won't remember your name, or you don't know when they'll stop. It'll affect them physically. Again, the lingering hope and the isolation. I have it under ambiguous grief, but it also fits under anticipatory grief. And both of these can lead to frozen grief. So Dr. Boss, who coined the ambiguous grief, she has said, I'm just going to read this quote from her. It's great. The culprit is the ambiguity. When an unbelievable, untenable circumstance roars into your life, a normal and healthy response is to feel unbelievably sad, confused, and angry, and more. And how would anyone be able to control all that? Expecting yourself to get over it and move on is unrealistic and cruel. Instead, learn to sit in the complex experience of ambiguous loss with acceptance that the loss will be ongoing since you may not be able to fix the ambiguity. So that's the challenge with the ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief to a certain degree is being willing to sit in that complex experience. We'll be watching a clip on grief a little bit later, which will talk about turning towards the suffering and how difficult it is when you turn towards the suffering of somebody who is experiencing these difficult types of grief. The last thing about these types of grief, it's important to note that neither one of these means that they will grieve any less after the death. Experiencing that beforehand doesn't mean that they will experience it after. So here are some of the impacts on people's lives when they're experiencing anticipatory or ambiguous grief. The ones on the left are what family caregivers may experience, and the ones on the right are what residents may be experiencing if they have dementia. Like I said before, people with dementia can experience ambiguous loss. They may be mourning their independence and certain cherished personal traits and abilities. So if people don't allow themselves to grieve or resume some of their regular activities, coping becomes more harder as conditions progress. So if you think about grief in the river of life, people can get stuck, like I said, in the whirlpool at the bottom of the waterfall. And being stuck or frozen can lead to complicated grief. It can also cause conflicting emotions. You're having multiple emotions at once. And if you're in that brain fog of grief, it's hard to pick those apart. People can be feeling very guilty that they're anticipating the death of their loved one or the loss of abilities while they're still with them. And so there's that tension. And then with that, with the ambiguity, is anxiety and fear. And like I said before, because these types of grief aren't recognized socially and there's no mourning, there's no outward symptoms or outward expressions to mark your grief, that can be cause a lot of loneliness and like just really feeling alone. So sorry, I'm just going to move on here. And we're going to skip this whiteboard just because in the interest of time, and I'd love to hear from you. So care planning for the resident to support anticipatory and ambiguous grief. We really want to focus on what the person can do at each stage of dementia or at each stage of their disease. We want to listen with empathy and offer comfort and reassurance without denying or discounting their expressed feelings. So it's all about coming alongside, taking the time to listen. It's also about making meaningful connections. So depending on their ability and based on their ability is to make meaningful connections in the moment. What has been a way that their family or friends have connected over the years, and try to incorporate those into their daily or weekly life. And this is where it becomes kind of a team effort because you're looking at the nurses and the care aides. Is there anybody that in recreation that can support this? I know when my grandmother was in long-term care, we have family all over the world, and she had gone to visit them. And so the recreational support, what they did is they set up with my sister in New Zealand, and she would FaceTime my sister, and she could see her grandkids and her great grandkids. So that was a really special way to continue those meaningful connections in the midst of that ongoing loss for her. And also learning intimate knowledge about the person. What's their personality? What are their needs? What are their interests? What are their likes? What are their dislikes? Do they like liver and onions? Do they hate liver and onions? My grandma liked it. I do not eat liver. What's their favorite activities? Is it lawn bowling? What's their life history? What's brings them meaning? And integrate this into their care plan and parts of their everyday life. Now we're going to talk about practical emotional strategies for support. So I've kind of focused this on the caregiver, but you'll see as we go through that these practical emotional strategies, they are for the person or the resident and the person who has the illness. So let's talk about laughter. Laughter is totally underrated. When have you asked the caregiver, when was the last time you had a good old belly laugh? And laughter has a way of bridging difficult and challenging experiences. When I was preparing for this, I spoke with a caregiver of 25 years, and she added the encouraging laughter, but also finding a source of joy. So she encouraged us to find a source of joy or beauty around us, noticing a bird out the window, and just acknowledging that beauty is around us at all times. And here's a quote from them. When we are in the heat of caregiving and grief, we don't always recognize the joy and beauty around us. Just taking a look at my notes. So while we prepare for the inevitable and we know what's happening, it's nothing can prepare us for it. Acknowledging it and discussing our emotions can help. So in the midst of the swirl of emotions, having somebody pick apart your emotions and name them can be really powerful. Also connecting to others who are having the same experience. So is there another resident who has a similar illness, and can you strategically connect the caregivers, over tea in the morning? Managing anxiety and fear. And with that, we're talking about not just, are they on medications, but it's the internal things like meditation and mindfulness. And that, the mindfulness, we talked a little bit about that in finding a source of joy and encouraging them to live their life. Like, yes, it seems like everything's on hold because they're in this ambiguous, uncertain loss and grief experience, but encourage them to do the things they can do. And then teaching and learning and teaching about rituals or ceremonies. Um, and this can be, if there's a ritual that they have every day, they come in and they have tea at 2 o'clock with their loved one. So if they're feeling like they can't do anything and they're flat that day, but they have tea at 2 o'clock, so they make that happen. Those rituals can really support people in the midst of these types of loss. And then in terms of comparisons, validating that everybody's grief journey is unique. Okay, we're coming to the end of our time, and this is one of our last slides. Okay, let's go through this. Name it. Accept that anticipatory grief is normal and planning for future losses. So this is about developing relationship and doing that teaching across their time with you. Anticipatory grief has been with us for and documented for over a century. These people are not alone. And acknowledging that their hopes and dreams for the future, they may tell you that they're completely shattered in the most painful way possible. Take the time to listen. And having something concrete to acknowledge their grief can be helpful, like a photo or a meaningful letter, something to hold on to and have with them. Again, looking at support systems, internal and external. So below you see connecting with caregivers or community resources. And then also sometimes people have a support system like in their church or in their bridge club or they've got a resident council in their retirement home. People don't always know how to ask for help, so supporting these people to ask for help in a way that works for them. Encouraging self-care, which as it's well documented that caregivers face a lot. They will ignore their own physical and mental health to the degree that they get into their own health crises. So self-care could even be, oh, your loved one is seeing the dentist or they're getting their teeth cleaned today. When was the last time you got your teeth cleaned and went to the dentist? Those sorts of things. And now, in terms of communication is, we think about it, communicating with the team, making sure everybody's on the same page, but it can also be how we talk. It's not either or, it's both and. So it's not I'm either a caregiver or not, or a caregiver or a wife. It's I am a caregiver and a wife. So modeling and supporting shifting how people communicate. And then last but not least, we have we clean our house, we do spring cleaning. Let's do some emotional spring cleaning. Let's see a counselor or a social worker. And then, of course, the spiritual supports that people have in their life. So these are all parts of care planning and approaches that we can incorporate to support caregivers. Now it's 1:24 and I want to get you out on time. So I'm not going to, there was a 3.5 minute video about grief. We can always send that out. I always leave you with, community supports. These are my top 5 in terms of support for your staff, for your caregivers and your residents. Go to your local hospice. They are such a resource. And then these About Grief and My Grief, those are from under Canadian Virtual Hospice. And then, of course, Alzheimer's Society of Canada. They have a great teaching booklet about ambiguous loss and grief. And then Center for Loss and Life Translation is features Dr. Alan Wolfeld's work, and he's all about companioning and walking alongside. Okay. Let's see if we can, I'm going to go back. And do you want to pop that last poll up, Simran? So if you want to, we kind of zoomed through the last part, but I'd like to kind of get a handle on how you're feeling, how confident you are in including care planning or even talking about care planning around anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief. So when we think back to the first poll, 70% have heard of anticipatory loss, and then only 30% had heard of ambiguous grief. So when you see those kind of numbers, I would say that would reflect here in moderate to high confidence, that 75% moderate to high confidence in care planning for anticipatory grief and ambiguous grief. Can stop sharing that. Thank you. So I want to end with grief is a normal human experience. Each person's experience and feelings and emotions are unique. I like this picture because grief support and care planning is all about one person showing up and being with another person who is suffering with grief, whether it be anticipatory or ambiguous grief. Now we have a few minutes left here for questions. Do we have any questions there?
Yeah, so there's at least one question. Teddy asked, how do you start the conversation about anticipatory grief? So I feel like we can definitely answer that question.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And when in terms of starting conversations, you can start with reflecting back to people. I've noticed I've seen you do, or your face has seen, your expressions have seemed more sad, or your body language is telling me this. And it could be related to something that we call anticipatory grief. Have you heard of that? And so that's a common counseling technique is like reflecting what the body is telling you about people's feelings and emotions. Or it could be, I went to this great lunch and learn the other day, and they were talking about anticipatory grief. I'd never heard of it. Have you heard of it? And using that as a way to introduce the subject or the topic.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. So we have one more question, but I would encourage Amanda to reach out to Lisa and Clara over email. And I just want to take a moment to thank both of you for presenting to us. This was definitely a very insightful and very timely presentation with everything that's going on. And I'm glad that participants were able to ask their questions and to engage with all of the different polls and the whiteboard exercises. So, folks, thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. And as I promised, I will reach out to all of you separately with the PDF of the slides and the video links and all of the other resources that Clara and Lisa shared with us very generously. So, thank you so much, Clara, Lisa, and thank you so much, everybody else, for joining us as well.
Thank you, Simran.
Yeah,
Appreciate the opportunity for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you, Simran, and thank you everyone for coming.
All right. Thank you so much, folks.